The first thing I remember is the thermos metal scuffed, beaded with heat in air that would have frozen a creek by morning. It sat between two unzipped sleeping bags inside a green canvas tent, steam lifting in thin threads, while the mountain around it held steady at 20 degrees. No voices, no footprints worth following. Just coffee breathing in a place where breath shouldn't have lingered that long. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Back then, my world was small enough to fold into a denim jacket pocket. I lived in a little rental off 19th Street, with a creaky porch step and a porch light that threw a warm circle on the sidewalk when the sun ducked behind the front range. My days were steady clock in at the community college balance numbers, until the columns lined up answer questions about lost tuition checks and carry a thermos of my own coffee that tasted faintly of the cinnamon I shook in by habit. Most afternoons I walked 2 blocks to a corner market for a paper and a quart of milk, and if the air had that downhill snap from the ridge, I'd fast walk home counting my steps like I used to count during track meets in high school. 8 houses, 3 maples, 1 mailbox with a dent the shape of someone's knee. Boulder had a rhythm then that fit in your palm. Students on 10 Speed's a record store that let you listen before you bought a hardware place where the doorbell chimed so high you felt it in your teeth. If a siren cut across Highway 36, you stopped your sentence and waited until it passed. Folks knew each other by dogs and cars more than by last names. Mrs. Jenkins had the beagle who refused to heel the Tanaka kids, had the Camaro with the crooked tailpipe. Evenings smelled like dry leaves and supper, and by the time it dipped to 28 degrees, windows were fogged and porches glowed like little stages holding steady against the cold. Caroline belonged to that light. She was my older sister by 3 years, but felt older by a mile, the kind of person who could tighten a bootlace with one hand and drink from a tin cup with the other without spilling a drop. She wore her hair in a high knot when she ran and let it fall when she was still, though stillness wasn't something she kept for long. She laughed with her whole chest. When she pulled up in our mom's Buick, you heard her before you saw the car radio loud heater rattling the loose change in the ashtray chiming as she turned. She worked the early shift at a bakery off Baseline and would show up with cinnamon rolls wrapped in wax paper and a grin that said she knew the morning better than anyone. Daniel was quieter Midwestern vowels, careful hands, a patience that settled you without asking for anything in return. He was the one who smoothed maps flat and traced the switchbacks with the tip of a pencil, showing Caroline where the ridge lifted like a pulled quilt and where wind would shear down if the temperature dropped too fast. He owned one wool sweater that looked older than he was, and when he set a pot to boil, he kept his hand near the handle like a promise. When he shook your hand, he gave you the exact pressure that let you feel stronger than you felt. The plan was simple, the way plans look on lined paper: a weekend up to Horseshoe Ridge trailhead, just off a Forest Service road that ran out of pavement quicker than your mind expected. Roughly 7 miles to the saddle, another mile to a windbreak of boulders. Caroline swore had the best view she'd found in a dry year. They'd be out 2 nights back before Monday morning, and I'd get the Buick on Sunday night so I could take our mom to choir. Caroline said it like she always said what she meant to do, clear, quick-moving toward the next sentence before the last one landed. We had dinner the night before they left: meatloaf, baked potatoes with butter softening inside the crisscross green beans that squeaked against your teeth. Mom liked to set the table proper, even when it was just us, plates warm from the oven-cloth napkins that had seen every birthday we'd ever had. Caroline kept reaching over to steal crust from my plate. Daniel pretended not to notice and then swapped plates entirely when he did. The news murmured in the other room about a cold front sliding down from Wyoming. I watched my sister's face when the map turned blue. She didn't flinch, only nodded toward Daniel like you saw it, and he nodded back. I already counted it. After supper, the kitchen turned into a gear check. Stove and fuel canisters. Matches in a Ziploc. A headlamp each and 1 extra because Daniel believed in redundant light. A coil of paracord. 2 bowls that nested so snugly you needed a fingernail to pry them apart. Carolyn lifted their tent from the bag with a kind of fondness I recognized. The pale green canvas had a patch over the left corner where the pole had punched through one windy spring. She'd sewn it herself with tiny stitches while we watched a late-night movie with the sound low. It smelled faintly of old wool and the cedar blocks she used to keep moths out of sweaters. She pressed the palm of her hand against it like checking a forehead for fever. 3 inches of new snow up high if the front rolls in quick, Daniel said, head bent over the weather radio. It'll crunch underfoot. Good for finding your way back to your own tracks. I like the crunch, Caroline said, tying the bag with a clean square knot. You like the sound, I told her. You always did. She smiled at me without looking up. You can hear when the world is honest, she said. That's all snow is, the ground telling the truth. Mom had the look she got when she wanted to be the one to say, don't go, but knew the mountain already had them. She kissed Daniel's cheek. We had learned early that you don't let the last words be fussy, and she smoothed Caroline's hair like she had when we were small. Turn back if your teeth chatter, she said. It's not a test. They slept at Mom's to get an early start. I took the Buick keys and left my own set of keys on the kitchen hook where we always left them, little brass tags clacking together. The house clicked into night in familiar order, dishwasher hum, thermostat tick. The soft thud of the refrigerator motor catching. I sat up too long with a book I wasn't reading, listening to wind, worry the elm in the front yard, counting the gusts and the silences between them. When the wind died, it felt like someone had opened a heavy door and let the house think for itself. Morning arrived with a sky as thin as porcelain. The air had that high metallic taste that shows up before a snow even when the street looks bare. I brewed coffee and poured it into a battered metal thermos that had kept heat across a lot of winters. By 6:10 a.m., I was at Mom's front window blinds tipped so I could watch the street without chopping the sunrise into stripes. Daniel came out first in jeans and a flannel soft steps carrying a blue plastic tub tipped with gear. Caroline followed 2 mugs balanced in one hand and a grin that made me feel 13 again. She set one mug on the hood of the Buick and cupped the other with both hands like she held a living thing. Save me a cinnamon roll? She said through the glass when she saw me watching. She mouthed the words big so I could read them, then hooked a thumb toward the sky. Early lunch at the Ridge, she added, miming a spoon like she was already tasting noodles. Daniel took the driver's seat. His breath ghosted the windshield until the defroster woke. Caroline put her hand flat on the dashboard like she was thanking the car in advance. She'd strapped the tent bag lengthwise so it wouldn't press weird against the pack spine. Her small adjustments always looked like care more than control. I stepped out with a scarf around my neck and handed up the thermos hot enough that steam rose when the cap opened. Daniel tucked it between the front seats. Promise I won't waste it, he said. We'll toast you from the saddle. Don't toast me, I said. Come back and tell me about it. We'll do both, he answered, not making it into a flourish, just the kind of steady line you can step onto. They turned onto the residential street, slow to miss the one bad pothole everyone knew, then eased toward the arterial. At the stop sign, Caroline leaned out the window and whistled a little tune our mother used to hum when the dryer buzzed the one that meant time to fold. She tapped the car door twice like knocking on wood. The sky above the foothills had gone the color of unripe plums. I watched their taillights drop down the hill and disappear. I showered, put on slacks, drove to work with the heater blowing on my shoes because the rubber mats felt like ice in the morning. At the college, I unlocked the office, clicked the fluorescent lights, and checked my inbox, where a professor from physical sciences had sent 3 different versions of the same petty complaint. Numbers absorbed me. That's why I liked them. They stayed if you asked them to, and they lined up when you did the steps right. Around 9:45 a.m., the first faint belt of cloud moved over the ridge. It looked like someone had dragged a chalky sleeve across a blue table. I didn't think storm. I thought scarf. The bank sign at the corner still read 41 to GEF, and the wind that came down the canyon felt almost friendly, cool fingers on the back of your neck after a hot kitchen. I took the long way back from the copy room just to smell it before the day closed in. At lunch, I ate leftover meatloaf cold and tried to guess where they were on the trail by the schedule they'd written on notebook paper. Mile 3 by noon if they kept an easy pace. I pictured the way Caroline always stopped at exactly the same kind of rock, a flat one with a seat the height of her knees, and the way Daniel took a picture from the same angle as if he could set a ruler inside the landscape and measure it from year to year. I pressed my palm to the thermos on my desk out of habit, even though it wasn't theirs. Old gestures have a way of multiplying. By mid-afternoon, the wind stopped pretending to be neighborly. You could feel it in the way doors took an extra tug to close. The bank sign dropped to 33 degrees. Someone down the hall turned the radio low, and the weatherman used phrases that always sounded calmer than they were. Light accumulation at elevation, a glaze possible on bridges. I penciled a note on the corner of my blotter to remember to salt the front steps at Mom's if it slicked up overnight. At 4:20 p.m., I got off early to beat the first real flurries. The college lot had that gray look parking lots take when the sun gives up. I stopped by the market to pick up milk and eggs and a bag of flour because Caroline always burned through flour when she was anxious, and I wanted it there for her on Monday night, even if she pretended she didn't need it. The cashier counted my change with the little swipe motion she'd done since I was a kid. Outside, a fine powder was already sneaking into the cracks between curb and road. I let myself into Mom's house just before 5. The kitchen light threw a square onto the floor. I set the milk in the fridge and craned my neck toward the living room to see if the blinking light on the answering machine was lit. Nothing yet. I straightened the stack of mail without meaning to. I flipped the porch light at 5:12 p.m., earlier than usual because that's what you do when your people are out in the dark. You make the door visible from half a block away. At 6, the radio said the pass had taken on a thin layer and to expect drifting above 7,000 feet. I pictured them tucked in the windbreak of boulders Caroline loved using the tent as a second skin, pulling the zipper slow so it wouldn't snag. I pictured Daniel pouring from the thermos, that quick honey-colored steam rising even when the air tasted like metal. I set 2 bowls on the counter out of reflex and then set them back in the cupboard, a little embarrassed, even though no one was there to see. I told myself I wouldn't call her on the trail phone unless the forecast turned mean. She'd rib me for hovering, then end the call with "love you" twice fast, like stepping over a crack. I did other things to keep my hands busy. Swept crumbs that weren't there, refolded towels that were already square, shook out the rug by the back door onto the concrete stoop where the snow gathered along its edge like someone had iced it. By 7, the street had gone quiet. Tires made that soft hush you hear when the first layer of powder sticks and every porch light on our block had clicked on without a word. The Buick sat in the driveway with a cold hood that reflected the porch bulb like a small moon. I stood at the front window with the blinds tipped again and felt the house lean a little toward the glass the way it leans in the last 10 minutes before company. No cars came up the hill, no late deliveries eased through the curve. No jogger trotted by in the reflective vest he wore even when the days were long. I checked the clock on the stove, 7:18 p.m. The answering machine still held its even green eye. The porch light hummed softly. I gave it another turn on the switch. The silly thing you do when you want the light brighter, even though you know electricity doesn't care about wanting. In the side yard, the elm creaked once low as if settling into the cold. I told myself I'd pour a cup of tea and wait for the phone to ring. The kettle began to whisper on the coil and then held there, never quite reaching a boil. By 8 o'clock, the neighborhood had gone to sleep, but our porch stayed bright. I set the second mug beside the first on the kitchen table and faced their empty chairs, steam unwinding into the same quiet air I'd been breathing all day. The house listened with me. The phone did not ring. The Buick's windshield wore a thin lace of snow, and the porch light burned longer than it ever had for an ordinary night. The kettle never quite reached a boil that night, and I remember standing there with my hand around the handle, watching the steam slip away before it became anything useful. The porch light still burned outside, and every few minutes I caught myself glancing at the driveway like the sight of that parked Buick might somehow answer the question forming quietly inside me. Why hadn't they called? I told myself not to be dramatic. The snow had come in earlier than expected, that was all. They'd be sitting tight somewhere higher up, waiting for a break in the weather. Caroline would have made a joke about instant coffee, and Daniel would have nodded like that was good enough for him. I pictured them that way, tucked into the mountain's cold belly, the tent glowing faintly from a lantern's heart, and for a moment, that image steadied me. But later that week, when the phone did ring, it was not my sister's voice I heard. It was a park ranger. He sounded careful the way people do when they're speaking through something they don't fully understand yet. He said 2 hikers were overdue, likely my sister and her fiancé. They had tracked the car to the Horseshoe Ridge trailhead, but no sign beyond that. It's probably weather-related, he added, like reassurance was part of his job. I didn't say much. There's a kind of silence that slips over you when the world changes too fast to name out loud. I left work early and drove to my mother's house. She opened the door before I even reached the porch, her face gray around the eyes. "It's about Caroline," she said, as if that alone explained everything. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she and Daniel had planned their route a few days earlier. Their coffee mugs were still on the counter, washed but not put away. My mother's hands shook just enough for me to notice when she reached for them. The ranger said the team would start at Dawn Snowshoe's Dogs, a small group of volunteers. I tried to picture the ridge in daylight, the angle of it, the rock faces she'd shown me once in a photograph. I remembered thinking how bare it looked, how easily a person could vanish between those folds of white. The next morning came sharp and clear, the kind of air that cracks when you breathe it. I drove to the ranger station in Boulder County, where men and women in thick park uniforms moved with quiet efficiency. They laid out maps on a folding table, tracing the ridgeline with their fingers, talking about switchbacks and tree lines, as if each word could conjure a missing footprint. I introduced myself. Caroline's sister Margaret, and one of the rangers nodded gently, his beard rimed with frost. "We'll bring them home," he said, though his tone made it sound like something between a hope and a prayer. They handed me a paper cup of coffee that tasted of metal and wood smoke, and I drank it just to keep my hands from shaking. By noon, the search teams had gone up. I stayed behind with my mother sitting in a corner of the station near the radio. The static filled every pause, and when it broke with a voice, the entire room would hold its breath. Around 3 o'clock, one came through clearly. "We found the camp." The ranger beside the radio scribbled something on a pad, asked for coordinates, and nodded once before meeting my eyes. He didn't say anything, but I could tell the moment had shifted. Something had been found, but not what anyone wanted. When the lead ranger returned that evening, the room fell silent. His jacket was still powdered with snow, his expression unreadable. He said they'd located a tent about 7 miles up the ridge. It was standing upright, in good shape considering the storm. Inside, there were 2 sleeping bags unzipped. Personal belongings were intact: food gear, boots, jackets. Nothing seemed out of place except for one thing: the tracks outside. 2 sets, he said quietly. Barefoot. I remember blinking, thinking I'd misheard him. He explained again slowly this time. 2 sets of human footprints in the snow toes, splayed heels pressed deep. They led away from the tent for maybe 30 yards, then stopped. Not faded, not covered, just stopped, as if the people who made them had stepped out of existence. My mother's breath hitched in a small, strangled sound. I hadn't heard from her since my father died. The ranger put a hand on her shoulder, awkward but sincere. "We'll keep searching," he said. "It's possible they were disoriented, hypothermic, maybe doubled back." But his eyes told me even he didn't believe it. That night I stayed at my mother's house again. The wind howled through the eaves, the kind of sound that gets under your skin and stays there. Neither of us slept much. Every time the furnace clicked on, she'd startle thinking it was the phone. Around 2 a.m., I got up and stood by the window watching the snow fall in steady ribbons beneath the streetlight. I thought about the ranger's words, barefoot 30 yards gone. My mind couldn't fit those pieces together in a way that made sense. The next day, I joined them at the base of the ridge. I told myself I'd just wait at the station, but waiting felt worse than the cold. The snow was deep waist-high in some places, the kind that muffles sound and swallows time. I watched the rescuers fan out with ropes and poles, their bright jackets moving like small flames against the white. The lead ranger pointed toward a slope where the tent stood a green dot in a field of silver. Up close, it looked almost peaceful, like a picture in a camping catalog. No rips, no wind damage, nothing to suggest panic. I helped hold the edge of the tent flap while the ranger took photographs. Inside, the air was still faintly metallic, the smell of nylon and something else, old smoke, maybe. 2 sleeping bags lay open, the fabric holding shallow depressions like someone had just risen from them. There was a thermos between them. The cap was off. The coffee inside was still warm. I stepped back instinctively the way you do when something tilts the world off its axis. "That's not possible," I said. The ranger gave a slow nod. "We thought the same." He showed me the logbook from the search team, times coordinates, everything recorded with precision. "We found this exactly as you see it," he said. "No signs of animals, no tracks leading in or out besides the ones we told you about." The wind picked up, then whipping snow against the canvas until it rattled like paper. I could see my own reflection in the thermos lid, small and distorted. My mind clung to the smallest details, Daniel's boots against the wall, Caroline's red windbreaker folded neatly beside her bag, the paperback novel tucked under a pillow. It was Wuthering Heights, the same copy she'd read at 17 Corners, turned spine-cracked. I had bought it for her with babysitting money. Seeing it there dry and intact was what finally broke me. The ranger rested a hand on my shoulder, but I barely felt it. "We'll expand the search tomorrow," he said. "We'll bring in more dogs, maybe aerial support if the weather holds." I nodded, though my body felt detached from the motion. Before we left, I asked to see the footprints. He hesitated, but agreed. We walked downhill a short distance until the trees thickened. There, clear as ink, were the prints, 2 sets side-by-side, toes pointed forward. They were crisp, recent-looking, as though pressed into fresh powder that morning. I crouched down, the cold biting through my gloves, and stared at them until my eyes watered. 30 yards further, the tracks stopped. The snow beyond was untouched. No drag marks, no sign of collapse. Just emptiness. We descended as the light failed the sky, turning violet at the edges. My mother was waiting at the base camp, wrapped in my father's old wool coat. When she saw my face, she didn't ask what I'd seen. She already knew enough from the silence around me. The next days blurred together. News vans appeared, questions we couldn't answer filled the air, and the mountain became something other than land. It became a mouth that swallowed sound and refused to give it back. The official search lasted 2 weeks. Helicopters swept the ridge, thermal drones mapped the slopes, and the county sent divers to the half-frozen riverbed at the base just in case. Nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no further tracks. On the 15th day, the search was called off. Presumed lost, the report said a phrase that felt like a door closing. For years after that, my mother and I lived in a strange rhythm of hope and resignation. We'd get calls sometimes. Someone thought they'd seen a man and woman hitchhiking in Idaho, or 2 hikers matching their description in the Cascades. Each time I'd feel the same flicker of heat in my chest, followed by the same cold after the police confirmed it wasn't them. Eventually the calls stopped. The world moved on the way it always does. By the early 2000s, my mother's health began to falter. When she passed in 2003, I cleaned out her house alone. In the back of her closet, I found a shoebox filled with Caroline's old postcards, and a photograph of the ridge taken from the trailhead, the date scrawled on the back, October 12th, 1985. Their last day. I remember turning the photo over and noticing something I hadn't before. In the corner of the frame behind the curve of a boulder, a figure stood blurred by distance but unmistakably human, tall alone facing the tent. I told myself it was just another hiker someone caught by chance in the shot. Still, I slipped the photo into a drawer and closed it gently. Nearly 20 years later, when the phone rang again, it was early morning. The sun had just reached the kitchen window, cutting through the same lace curtain my mother used to hang. I almost didn't answer, thinking it was a telemarketer. But when I heard the man's voice, calm, steady, official, it stopped me cold. Mrs. Ellison, this is Detective Samuel Hayes, Boulder County Cold Case Division. I hope I'm not disturbing you. The name alone turned my stomach. I hadn't heard anyone say Boulder County out loud in years without that old ache crawling back up. He paused like he was measuring how much truth to let through the line. I'm calling about the disappearance of your sister Caroline and her fiancé Daniel Price. October 1985. Horseshoe Ridge. My hand tightened around the receiver. He didn't need to say more. The sound of his voice cracked open something I'd buried under decades of careful living. He told me there'd been a discovery. A tent green canvas found high on the ridge, intact, upright, undisturbed. My breath caught. That's not possible, I said before I even realized I was speaking. He didn't argue. I'd like to meet in person, he said instead. There are photographs you need to see. When the call ended, I stood there with the phone still pressed to my ear, the dial tone humming low. Outside, autumn had returned to Colorado the way it always did. Crisp, light, dry leaves skipping down the sidewalk. But something in me had shifted back to that night in 1985, standing by the window with the porch light burning against the snow. Only this time the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like it was waiting for me to answer. That night I laid out the old photograph of the ridge beside my coffee cup. The same boulders, the same line of trees. And for the first time since the disappearance, I found myself wondering not if they had died, but if they had ever truly left. Detective Hayes met me the next afternoon at a small diner off Canyon Boulevard, one of those places that still served coffee in thick white mugs and played the same country songs from the 80s on a loop. He was a tall man, maybe in his early 60s, with the kind of posture that comes from carrying too many stories that never left him. When he shook my hand, I noticed a faint tremor, age, not nerves, and a small scar along his knuckle pale against his skin. He'd brought a manila folder sealed with a rubber band and kept it close to him until we'd both ordered. Then, without much ceremony, he slid it across the table. I want you to see these before we talk, he said. Inside were photos printed on matte paper, each dated just 2 weeks prior. The first was a wide shot of a snowy ridge, quiet and unremarkable. The next made me set my coffee down. It was the tent green canvas, faded but standing straight, snow-brushed from the edges like someone had cared for it. The zipper was halfway open, and through it I could see 2 sleeping bags, same color, same shape. Between them sat a metal thermos lid unscrewed. We found this in early September, he said. Condition doesn't make sense for how long it's been exposed. I asked where, though I already knew the answer. Horseshoe Ridge, he said. Same coordinates recorded from the 85 report. I leaned back, trying to process what he was saying. You're telling me that tent, my sister's tent, survived 36 years in the open like that? He exhaled slowly through his nose. That's what doesn't sit right with us. We ran material analysis, fabric dating it's old. Yes, but not weathered enough. Coffee inside was fresh. Temperature of the thermos matched ambient air when we got there. He paused, then added, as if it had just been poured. He let that hang between us for a while. The hum of the diner filled the space that words couldn't. Then he opened another envelope and pulled out a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside was a slip of paper, yellowed but crisp edges dry handwriting I knew instantly my sister's. It was her rounded script, the way she looped her lowercase g like a question mark. The note read, "It's inside the tent." I felt my throat close, not from shock exactly, but from a recognition that sank deeper than reason. She'd written that line after they vanished. I knew it the way you know your own heartbeat. "Where did you find this?" I managed. "Folded under the sleeping bag," he said. Top layer of soil under the tent had minimal compression. There's no way it's been sitting in that position for decades. Someone's been up there since. The rest of the day unfolded in fragments. I remember the sound of cars sliding through the afternoon rain outside, the way the napkin stuck to my palm when I wiped my face. The detective's voice, steady, deliberate. He said they'd reopened the case, officially coordinating with federal search teams because of the proximity to national forest land. "I want you involved," he told me. "You know her better than anyone left alive." I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to stay anchored in the diner where things smelled like grease and sugar, and time still made sense. But another part, the quieter one, knew this wasn't something I could turn from, so I nodded. 2 days later, I met him again at the ranger outpost near the trailhead. It looked almost the same as I remembered, the same hand-painted sign, same gravel crunch under tires. The air was thinner, drier, that early autumn sharpness that carries a promise of snow. Hayes handed me a radio and a headlamp standard issue, then pointed up toward the ridge. "We'll go slow," he said. "Take breaks when you need to." It was a 5-hour hike to where the tent had been rediscovered. Along the way, he told me bits of what the team had found since that first day, 2 partial footprints near a fallen log, one matching a women's shoe size 7, the other unidentifiable. They'd been too recent to belong to my sister yet, too isolated to belong to modern hikers. "It's like someone walks the ridge at night," he said, glancing ahead, always barefoot. I didn't respond. Some things don't need words to feel real. When we reached the site, the air felt wrong, stiller than it should have been. The tent had been removed for forensics, but the ground still carried its shape, the flattened ring of snow around where it had stood. Hayes motioned me closer. "We left the soil mostly untouched," he said. "Wanted you to see this." He crouched, brushing away a thin layer of frost with his gloved hand. Beneath it was a small indentation the size of a handprint pressed deep into the earth. "Left palm," he murmured. "Blood traces not fresh, but not old either." I knelt beside him. "Could it be animal?" "No," he said. "Human. DNA lab says partial match to Caroline Ellison confirmed through familial reference." My knees gave out, and I had to steady myself against a nearby rock. "How can that be?" I whispered. "If she's gone." He finished the sentence for me. "Then someone brought her blood here." We spent the next few hours combing through the immediate area, marking locations with small orange flags. There were pieces of rope, fragments of nylon fabric, even a rusted compass that looked familiar. But what caught me most was the smell, smoky like extinguished fire, faint but present. Hayes said they'd found traces of char near the tree line, as if someone had been camping there recently. "No food waste, no tracks," he said. "Whoever's been here knows how to vanish clean." Before we packed up, he told me about a man named Charles Lang, a transient outdoorsman with prior arrests for trespassing on federal land in the early 90s. He used to live off old mines and abandoned ranger shacks, Hayes explained. We think he might have taken things from missing campsites, maybe more. He showed me a faded mugshot, sunken eyes, graying beard expression empty of anything human. We've had reports of him near the ridge over the years. Always alone. Always watching hikers from a distance. Back at the station, I sat in the corner while Hayes took a call. I could only hear his half of the conversation, short-clipped professional. When he hung up, he said another hiker had reported seeing a man fitting Lang's description just a few miles west, sitting by a riverbank, staring at the water. "We'll send a team in the morning," he said. That night I stayed in a nearby motel. The walls were thin and the wind rattled the windows like someone tapping politely to be let in. Around midnight I woke to a sound outside, soft steps on gravel, slow and deliberate. I peered through the curtain but saw nothing but darkness and the faint glint of frost on the cars. I told myself it was a deer, maybe, or a shift in the wind. But before I let the curtain fall, I caught sight of something that made my blood go cold, a single barefoot print in the thin layer of snow by my door. I didn't sleep after that. By dawn, Hayes was back, eyes red from the road. "We found Lang," he said, but not how we expected. He laid a photograph on the table, Lang's campsite half collapsed. Personal belongings scattered. Among them was a worn leather pouch filled with human teeth. "He's gone," Hayes said. "Vanished before we got there. But he left something behind." Inside the pouch was another slip of paper. It read, "It's still inside." My hands shook when I read it. The handwriting wasn't Caroline's. It was heavier, uneven, almost childlike. The following week blurred into a rhythm of interviews, search grids, and sleepless nights. Reporters called, though I never spoke to them. I kept my attention on the tent, the note, and that print outside my motel door. Hayes became quieter too. One evening, while reviewing the evidence, he said, "Do you ever feel like some places remember more than people do?" I told him I did now. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the map spread between us. "We're missing something," he murmured. "Something simple that ties it all together." A few days later, a librarian from a small town in Montana called the tip line. She said she'd seen a man who looked like Lang using a public computer to check news about the Horseshoe Ridge discovery. He was quiet, she said. Polite. But when the screen showed a photo of the tent, he started shaking. The FBI coordinated with local authorities to pick him up. They found him that night sitting on a park bench with a small pack at his feet. When agents approached, he didn't run. He just looked up and said, "You're too late. They're already part of it." I wasn't there when they questioned him, but Hayes told me later what he confessed to. Lang admitted he'd followed Caroline and Daniel up the ridge that weekend in 1985. He said he'd watched them set camp, that he'd heard them laughing, cooking noodles. Then something changed. "They heard me," he said. "I couldn't let them leave." When pressed, he described striking them with a river stone, quick and clean, and burying their bodies beneath the roots of an old oak that later fell in a storm. Afterward, he returned to their camp, drank their coffee, and waited until the snow covered everything. "The mountain told me to keep them," he said. When Hayes recounted those words, I felt hollow. There was no anger left, only the slow ache of understanding that the mystery had been human all along. Lang had spent decades drifting, revisiting the ridge like a shrine, maintaining the tent as if preserving a secret he couldn't release. The blood, the footprints, even the fresh coffee, they were all part of his ritual, his way of keeping them alive in his mind. "He's being charged in multiple states," Hayes said, linked to another case in Washington with the same method. I nodded but didn't speak. Some truths, when they finally arrive, don't feel like relief. They feel like gravity. That night I sat outside the motel under a sky clear enough to see the faint streak of the Milky Way. The air was cold, the kind that burns clean through your lungs. I thought about Caroline's note. It's inside the tent. I wondered if she'd meant him or something older than him. Maybe she knew before the end that the danger wasn't the mountain or the weather, but a man who listened to the same silence they did and decided to fill it with something terrible. I closed my eyes, and in that stillness, I almost heard her whistle the same tune she'd played through the Buick window the morning she left. It came faintly, just once, carried by wind from somewhere high above the ridge. When I opened my eyes, the night was quiet again, and I knew tomorrow I'd have to climb back up one last time to see where it all ended. When they brought me back up the ridge that final morning, The air had that thin, electric stillness that always comes before a storm. The light was sharp, brittle, almost like the world had been reduced to edges. Snow clung to the shaded slopes in long, uneven ribbons, and the trail beneath our boots gave that hollow crunch that carries for miles when the wind drops. Detective Hayes walked ahead of me, one hand resting on the strap of his pack, his breath a slow rhythm in the cold. We didn't talk much. There was a kind of reverence in that silence, as if the mountain itself was listening. By the time we reached the old camp clearing, the sun had lowered behind the ridge, and everything around us turned that dull silver that comes just before dusk. I could see the hollow in the ground where the tent had stood. The soil was disturbed again, fresh tracks from the forensics team that had been here the day before, but under it all I could still sense the shape of that impossible moment when they found the tent, as though time had folded in on itself. Hayes stopped near a fallen pine and crouched, brushing frost from the ground with the back of his glove. "This is where Lang said it happened," he said, voice low. He came from that tree line, waited until dark. He pointed to a depression in the earth that could have been anything. A log's shadow, a man's mark. He hit Daniel first. Hayes continued one blow, then turned on your sister. I knelt beside him not because I needed to see, but because my legs didn't trust the air anymore. The ground smelled faintly of minerals and decay. I imagined Caroline there, startled awake by the sound of something heavy breaking the silence, reaching for Daniel before she even understood what was happening. There's a point in every story, I think, where the mind stops protecting you from the details. I'd crossed it long ago. Hayes reached into his pack and pulled out a small evidence pouch. Inside was a stone smooth and round the size of a grapefruit. It was streaked with what looked like rust but wasn't. The weapon, he said. We found it buried near the creek bed right where he said he threw it. I stared at that stone longer than I meant to. It looked ordinary, something you'd skip across a lake, something that could have come from anywhere. But in that moment, it carried the full weight of 36 years. He used this, I asked, though I already knew. Hayes nodded. He said he wanted it to be quick. We walked down toward the ravine where a cluster of oaks bent low against the wind. The one at the center had fallen long ago, its roots exposed like a frozen wave. Under here, Hayes said quietly. That's where they were. A team had already cleared the debris. The excavation had been careful, almost surgical. Beneath the old roots, the soil was still darker, damp from meltwater, the kind of cold that seeps straight into your hands. I stood there not as a sister or a witness, but as something smaller, just a person trying to make sense of what the earth decides to keep and what it lets go. Hayes took a step back to give me space. We found personal items mixed in with the remains, he said. A bracelet, a fragment of red nylon, and what's left of a thermos lid. My mother had given Caroline that bracelet when she turned 21. Simple silver, nothing fancy. She used to spin it around her wrist when she was nervous. I remember hearing that soft clink against the ceramic counter when she'd wait for the kettle to boil. I never thought I'd hear it again, even in memory. I wanted to thank the detective for his patience, for the respect he gave that ground, but the words wouldn't come out right. Instead, I crouched and pressed my palm to the dirt. It was cold enough to burn. We stayed until the light began to fade. A light snow started so fine it looked more like ash than weather. Hayes broke the silence first. Lang's talking more now, he said. Not all of it makes sense, but some pieces fit. He told me that Lang had been living out of an abandoned mine for years, using old hiking trails as his territory. He'd chosen the ridge because no one went that high anymore. He scavenged from old campsites, learned to patch gear, even mimicked the handwriting of people he'd stolen from. He says he found Caroline's old journal, Hayes said, and copied lines from it into those notes we found, the ones that looked like her writing. He hesitated. He said he wanted her voice to live on. I didn't answer. There are moments where silence is the only response that keeps you from breaking. We started back toward the trailhead, our headlamps cutting narrow tunnels through the dark. The air had gone still again, the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Every few minutes I'd catch the smell of pine and smoke, the same faint scent I'd noticed near the tent weeks before. It felt like a memory looping back on itself, as if the mountain was replaying what it couldn't forget. When we reached the halfway point, Hayes stopped to radio his team. Static filled the channel. Then a voice came through, faint, distant, but clear enough. "We've got something else. North Ridge cave system. You'll want to see this." He looked at me. "You can wait in the truck," he said. But I didn't. I followed him up the narrow incline until the trail widened into a small ledge overlooking the valley. The cave entrance was hidden behind a curtain of brush, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Inside, the air was colder, heavier. The beam from Hayes's flashlight cut across the walls, revealing marks, carvings, dozens of them. Faces, shapes, initials. Some new, some so old they'd nearly faded back into the rock. And there, etched deeper than the rest, was Caroline's name. I moved closer, tracing the letters with my fingertips. The grooves were uneven, hurried, but it was hers. I could tell by the way she wrote her A like an open triangle. Below her name, another word was carved in the same style, Daniel. Beneath that, smaller, shakier letters formed something else. "Help us." The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly in Hayes's hand. "We think he made her carve those," he said softly. "Right before." I stepped back, my legs unsteady. The cold in that cave wasn't just temperature. It was the kind of cold that seeps from memory itself, the kind that lingers long after the light leaves. On the far wall, someone had drawn a series of circles with ash and soot, each one overlapping the next until they formed a shape like a spiral. Hayes said Lang claimed it represented the mountain's eye. I don't know what I felt looking at it. Pity, horror, disbelief, but for the first time I sensed how deep his madness had gone. "He said they're still here," Hayes murmured, "that he hears them talking when the wind changes." We left the cave in silence. The hike down felt longer than the climb up. By the time we reached the base, snow was falling, harder flakes big enough to sting when they hit your skin. Hayes offered to drive me back, but I asked for a few minutes alone. He nodded, understanding. I walked a little ways down the road until the headlights disappeared behind a bend. The night was black and soundless except for the faint rush of the creek. I stood there until my feet went numb, staring at the ridgeline barely visible against the sky. Somewhere up there beyond the reach of the road, the cave waited in its eternal dark, holding the last traces of the people I loved most. When I finally made it back to town, the streetlights looked too bright, too civilized for what I'd just seen. I checked into the same motel as before. My hands shook so badly I couldn't fit the key into the door on the first try. Inside, I poured a glass of water and sat on the edge of the bed. The radio on the nightstand was still tuned to the local station. The weather announcer said the temperature would drop into the teens, overnight wind gusts up to 30 miles per hour. I pictured the ridge again, snow burying the cave entrance, covering the carvings one flake at a time until all that remained was silence. I must have drifted into a half-sleep because when I opened my eyes again, the room was dark except for the thin glow from the parking lot outside. That's when I saw it, a small envelope slid under the door. My heart stuttered. I got up slowly, every movement careful. The envelope was plain unmarked. Inside was a piece of torn notebook paper. It smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. On it, written in the same uneven hand as the last note, were 4 words. "She's still with me." I sat there for a long time staring at that paper, the hum of the radiator filling the room. I didn't wake Hayes right away. I just listened to the wind against the window, to the ticking of the baseboard heater, to the sound of my own breath catching in my chest. For the first time since it began, I understood that some stories don't end when the truth comes out. Some keep circling back, waiting for the living to answer the questions the dead never could. And out there, somewhere beyond the ridge, a man who'd buried my sister's body still believed she hadn't left him. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my journal next to Caroline's photograph. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether they'd find Lang again, whether justice would ever feel like enough. But I knew I'd have to return to that mountain one last time. Not for closure, but to look that place in the eye and tell it I'd seen what it tried to keep hidden. Then maybe, just maybe, I could let the silence have her. The morning after the note appeared, the world felt muted, like the air itself was holding its breath. I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the window of that motel room until the first pale light touched the ridge. Every sound, every gust, every car passing in the distance made my heart rise and fall, like I was waiting for someone who would never arrive. When Hayes finally called, I told him about the envelope. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We'll handle it," his voice steady but softer than usual. He'd learned by then that certain words comfort closure. Peace don't belong in stories like this. By noon, the note was in evidence. The handwriting was compared, the paper analyzed. It was Lang's. But there was something else, trace ash, the same kind found in the cave. It meant he'd been close, maybe even watching that night while I slept just a thin wall away. The thought made my skin crawl, but more than fear, what I felt was exhaustion. 36 years of not knowing had already taken its toll. One more shadow in the dark didn't surprise me anymore. What mattered now was the truth, no matter how small or strange. Lang didn't stay hidden for long. He was found 2 towns over trying to trade an old pocket knife at a thrift shop. The clerk recognized him from the news and called it in. When the police arrived, he didn't fight. He didn't even speak. They said he looked calm, almost relieved. At the station, he refused food, water, everything except his small leather pouch, the one that had once held those human remains. He kept it folded in his hands like a rosary. When Hayes questioned him, Lang said very little about the killings themselves. What he talked about was the mountain. "It's not done with her," he said. "She talks when the wind moves right. That's how I know where to go." Hayes told me later he'd never seen someone so consumed by their own creation, like he'd built a religion out of guilt. They charged him with 5 murders, total Caroline and Daniel among them, and 3 others from other national forests, all unsolved cases with his fingerprints now tied to evidence. The DA wanted life without parole. Lang didn't contest it. He signed the plea and asked only one question before the hearing: will they take care of her? When Hayes asked what he meant, Lang smiled a small hollow smile and said, "The woman in the tent." The sentencing was held in a small federal courtroom in Denver. I went, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe to see the face of the man who had held my sister's last moments in his hands. Maybe to remind myself that evil sometimes looks ordinary. Lang sat at the defense table, thin and gray, his hands cuffed but resting neatly in front of him. When the judge read the charges, he didn't blink. When they showed the photographs of the ridge, his eyes softened like he was looking at an old photograph of home. When it was my turn to speak, I stood but couldn't look at him. Instead, I looked at the prosecutor, then at the wall behind him, and I told the court what Caroline was like when she laughed. How she'd hum while tying her boots, how she'd press her finger against a coffee cup to feel the warmth before drinking. I said her name out loud, just her name, and the courtroom went silent. For a moment, it felt like the whole building was listening. Lang was sentenced to life without parole. As they led him away, he turned once, just enough to meet my eyes. There was no hatred there, no remorse. Just that same strange calm I'd seen in his photograph. Hayes later told me that men like him don't feel guilt the way others do. They just feel unfinished. After the trial, the ridge was closed to hikers for almost a year. Forensic teams finished their work, and the cave was sealed not out of superstition, but out of respect. I went up once more before they closed it. The drive was quiet, no radio, no conversation, just the hum of tires and the rhythm of my own heartbeat. When we reached the base, I asked Hayes to give me a few minutes alone. He understood. I walked the same path my sister had walked decades earlier, the same route Lang had followed her down. The air was clear, the sky wide open. Snow still lingered in patches beneath the trees, glinting like glass in the sun. When I reached the hollow where the tent had once stood, I stopped. There was nothing left now. No footprints, no canvas, no trace of the lives that had once filled this space. Just the sound of wind through branches and the faint trickle of meltwater. I knelt and placed my hand on the ground. It was cold, but not lifeless. In that silence, I imagined Caroline standing beside me, her hair loose, her voice steady. I could almost hear her say it. "It's okay now. You can go home." I stayed until my legs went numb. When I finally stood, I left a small object behind her bracelet. It had been cleaned and returned after the investigation, and I'd kept it on my dresser ever since. I pressed it into the earth and covered it with a handful of soil. "This is where you stop carrying me," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to her or myself. Then I turned and walked back down the trail. In the years that followed, life didn't go back to normal. Normal isn't something that returns. But it found a quieter rhythm. The case was cited in federal reports about wilderness safety and missing persons. Hayes retired not long after, and sometimes he sends me postcards from the coast. He never mentions the case, just weather fishing the color of the sunsets. I think that's his way of saying he remembers without reopening the wound. As for me, I stayed in Boulder. I still work at the college. Some mornings when the fog lifts off the mountains, I find myself looking west and wondering if the ridge is watching back. Every September, I drive out to the edge of the forest where the road ends. I bring coffee in the old metal thermos, pour a small cup, and set it on a flat rock. I never say anything aloud. I just stand there and let the wind move around me. Some years it's gentle, others sharp enough to sting, but it always carries the same faint sound like a whistle breaking through distance, whether it's memory air or something else I've stopped trying to decide. People sometimes ask why I tell this story now after all this time. The truth is, stories like this don't belong to one person. They belong to every family that's ever waited by a phone that didn't ring, every person who stood in the cold with no answers, and every soul who's had to learn that justice doesn't undo what's already been done. We don't tell these stories to reopen pain. We tell them so silence doesn't win. I don't visit the cave anymore. I don't need to. I've learned that memory isn't tied to place, it's tied to what you refuse to forget. Caroline was more than what happened to her. She was light in a world that can turn dark without warning. And sometimes when the nights stretch long and quiet, I still catch myself listening for her whistle, faint but clear, carried by wind from somewhere I can't reach. That's how I know she's still here, not trapped, not lost, just part of the air that never stops moving. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.